Book 2, Chapter 1, From Charybdis to Scylla. Night comes early in January. The streets were already dark when Gringoire left the palace. He welcomed this darkness, for he longed to reach some obscure, deserted alley where he might meditate in peace, and where philosophy might first apply its dressing to his wounds. Besides, philosophy was his only refuge, for he did not know where to go to find lodging for the night. After the conspicuous miscarriage of his first dramatic attempt, he dared not return to that apartment which he had occupied in the Rue Grenier-sur-Lot, opposite the Port au Foin, having counted upon what the provost would give him for his opus to pay Master Guillaume d'Ulxire, collector of the cattle taxes in Paris, the 6 months' rent he owed him, that is, 12 sols parisis, 12 times the value of all he possessed in the world, including his breeches, his shirt, and his cap. Temporarily sheltered under the little gateway to the prison belonging to the treasurer of the Sainte-Chapelle, he considered for a moment the lodging he should select for the night, having all the pavements of Paris from which to choose. He remembered noticing the week before, in the Rue de la Savaterie, at the door of a councillor to Parliament, a footstone for mounting a mule. At that time he had said to himself that this stone might serve upon occasion as an excellent pillow for a beggar or a poet. He thanked Providence for having sent him this happy idea. But as he was preparing to cross the square of the palace in order to reach the tortuous labyrinth of the city, where all those ancient sisters, the streets of La Barillerie, Vieille Draperie, La Savaterie, La Juiverie, etc., wend their twisting way, and whose 9-story houses are still standing today, he saw the procession of the Fool's Pope, which was also pouring out of the palace and across the square, still shouting, now illumined by the torches, and, moreover, accompanied by Gringoire's own music. The sight hurt his vanity, and he fled. In the bitterness of his dramatic misadventure, everything which called to mind the festivities of the day accentuated his sorrow, reopened his wounds, and caused them to bleed afresh. He would have crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, but children were running up and down with fireworks and firecrackers. "Curses on those fireworks," muttered Gringoire, and he turned back to the Pont au Change. On the front of the houses near the entrance of the bridge they had attached banners. On 3 of them were paintings to represent the King, the Dauphin, and Margaret of Flanders, and on 6 smaller banners were portrayed the Duke of Austria, the Cardinal of Bourbon, and the Monsieur de Beaujeu, and Madame Jeanne of France, and Monsieur the Bastard of Bourbon, and I don't know who else besides, all lighted by torches. The crowd stood admiring them. "Happy artist Jean Faubourg," sighed Gringoire, as he turned his back on this exhibition. Before him ran a street so dark and empty that he hoped there to forget all his mental suffering by escaping every glimmer of the festivities. He hurried into it. A few minutes later, he struck his foot against some obstacle. He tripped and fell. It was the bundle of hawthorn branches which the clerks of the Besos had placed that morning at the door of the President of Parliament, in honor of the solemnity of the day. Gringoire bore this new accident heroically. He got up and reached the river's edge, leaving behind him the civil court and the criminal court, and, passing along the high walls of the royal gardens, on that unpaved strand where he was up to his ankles in mud, he arrived at the western part of the city. For some time he gazed at the small island of the Passeur aux Vaches, which has since given way to the Pont Neuf with its bronze horse. In the semi-darkness, the islet appeared to him like a black mass across a narrow stream of glistening water. By the glimmer of a faint light one could make out a beehive-shaped hut, where the ferryman sheltered himself during the night. "O happy ferryman," thought Gringoire, "you have no dreams of glory, nor do you write epithalamiums. What is it to you if the kings and duchesses of Burgundy marry? You know no marguerites but the daisies which your April meadow gives your cows to crop, while I, a poet, am hooted. I shiver with cold. I owe 12 sous, and the soles of my shoes are so thin that you could use them to glaze your lantern. Thank you, ferryman. Your hut gives rest to my eyes and makes me forget Paris. He was awakened from his almost lyric reverie by the explosion of a double petard which suddenly came from that peaceful cabin. It was the ferryman himself who was sharing in the festivities of the day, and setting off his fireworks. The explosion made Gringoire's hair stand on end. "Oh, cursed holiday!" he cried. "Will you follow me everywhere? Oh, my God, even to the ferryman's hut!" Then he gazed at the Seine at his feet, and he was seized with a terrible temptation. "Oh," said he, "how gladly I would drown myself if the water were so cold." Then it was that he made a desperate resolution. To wit, since he could not escape the fool's Pope, Jehan Fourbeau's paintings, the bundles of hawthorn, and the firecrackers, he would go to the Place de Grève and plunge himself wholeheartedly and merrily into all these festivities. At least, he thought, I shall be able to warm myself by the bonfire and to sup on some crumbs from the 3 great chests of sugar plums that will have been set out there on the public buffets of the city. Chapter 2. The Place de Grève. There remains today but a very small vestige of the Place de Grève as it existed formerly, and that is the once charming turret which occupies the northern corner of the square. It is now covered by unsightly whitewash that encrusts the delicate lines of its sculpture. Likely the whole turret will soon disappear, submerged by that flood of new houses which is so rapidly obliterating all the old facades in Paris. Those who, like ourselves, never pass over the Place de Grève without looking piteously and sympathetically at this poor turret, squeezed as it is between 2 paltry houses of the period of Louis XV, can easily reconstruct in imagination the assemblage of edifices to which it belonged, and thus imagine themselves in that 15th century Gothic square. It was then, as now, an irregular trapezium, bounded on one side by the quay, and on the other 3 by a series of high, narrow, gloomy houses. During the daytime one could admire the variety of these buildings, all sculptured in stone or wood, and offering perfect examples of the various kinds of domestic architecture of the Middle Ages, going back from the 15th to the 11th century. From the square window which then was beginning to supersede the pointed arch, back to the semicircular Roman arch, which had been supplanted by the pointed arch and which still occupied the first story of that ancient house of the Tower of Roland, at the corner of the square next to the Seine, on the same side as the Rue de la Tannerie. By night, nothing was distinguishable of that mass of buildings except the black, jagged outline of the roofs encircling the square with their chain of pointed gables. One of the essential differences between the town as it was then and as it is today is that now the fronts of the houses face the squares and streets, but then it was the backs. For 2 centuries past, the houses have been turned around. In the center, but towards the eastern side of the square, rose a heavy hybrid pile formed by 3 masses of houses in juxtaposition. It was called by 3 names which explain its history, its purpose, and its architecture. The Dauphin's house, because Charles V, when Dauphin, had lived in it. The Marchandise, because it served as the Hôtel de Ville, and the Pillar House, on account of a series of heavy pillars which supported its 3 stories. The town had there all that a good town like Paris needs: a chapel to pray in, a court-room for holding magisterial settings and on occasion for reprimanding the king's officers, and in the lofts an arsenal stocked with artillery. For the good people of Paris, well knowing that it is not sufficient in every emergency to plead and pray for the franchises of the city, have always, in reserve, In the attics of the Hôtel de Ville, a few good rusty harquebuses. The Place de Grève then had that sinister aspect which it retains today, owing to the unpleasant ideas which it excites, and owing to the gloomy Hôtel de Ville of Dominique Bougador which has replaced the pillar house. It must be observed that a permanent gibbet and pillory, a justice and a ladder, as they were then called, erected side by side in the middle of the pavement, contributed not a little to make the passer-by avert his eyes from this fatal spot, where so many human beings full of life and health suffered their last agony. It was this gibbet that 50 years later was to give birth to that Saint Vallier fever, as it was called, that terror of the scaffold, the most monstrous of all sicknesses, because it is inflicted not by the hand of God, but by man. It is a consolation, let it be said in passing, to reflect that the death penalty, which, 300 years ago, then encumbered with its iron wheels, with its stone gibbets, with all its apparatus for execution permanently fixed in the ground, the Place de Grève, Les Halles, the Place Dauphine, the Croix du Trottoir, the Marché aux Pourceaux, the hideous Montfaucon, the Barrière de Sargent, the Place aux Chats, the Porte Saint-Denis, Champeaux, the Porte Baudet, the Porte Saint-Jacques, not to mention the innumerable ladders of the provosts, the bishop, the chapters, the abbots, the priors, not to mention the judicial drownings in the river Seine. I repeat, it is consoling to reflect that now, after losing, one by one, all those pieces of her panoply, her profusion of executions, her refined and fanciful torments, her torture, for applying which she made afresh every 5 years a bed of leather, in the Grand Châtelet, this old queen of feudal society had nearly been thrust out of our laws and our towns, tracked from code to code, driven from place to place, so that she now possesses, in our vast metropolis of Paris, but one dishonored corner of the Place de Grève, only one miserable guillotine, stealthy, anxious, ashamed, which seems always afraid of being taken red-handed, so quickly does it vanish after dealing its fatal blow. Chapter 3. Besos para Golpes. When Pierre Gringoire arrived at the Place de Grève he was freezing cold. He had gone by the way of the Pont aux Meuniers, to avoid the crowds on the Pont au Change and Jehan Fourbeau's banners, but the wheels of all the bishop's mills had splashed him as he passed by, so that his coat was soaking wet. Furthermore, it seemed to him that the failure of his play made him feel the cold even more. Accordingly, he hastened towards the bonfire which was burning magnificently in the middle of the square, and joined the good-sized group already there. "Those damned Parisians!" he said to himself, for Gringoire, like many dramatic poets, was given to soliloquy. "Now they block me from the fire, and yet I need the warmth of some chimney corner. My shoes are full of holes, and all these cursed mills have been raining on me. The devil takes the Bishop of Paris, and his mills. I'd like to know what a bishop wants with a mill. Does he expect some day to become a miller bishop? If he only needs my curses to do so, I heartily give them to him, and to his cathedral, and to his mills. Let's see now if any of these valets will make room for me. I'd like to know what they are doing here. Warming themselves? Fine pleasure. Staring into the fire? Fine spectacle." But when he looked more closely, he saw that the circle was much larger than was necessary for these people merely to warm themselves. Then he observed that the burning logs were not the only attraction. In a wide space left clear between the crowd and the fire, a young girl was dancing. But was it a young girl, or a fairy, or an angel? Gringoire, skeptical philosopher and ironical poet that he was, could not at first decide, so deeply was he fascinated by this dazzling vision. She was not tall, but her slender lightsomeness made her appear so. Her complexion was dark, but one guessed that by daylight it would have the beautiful golden tint of Andalusian and Roman women. Her small feet, too, were Andalusian, for they seemed at once tight yet comfortable in her dainty shoes. She pirouetted on an old Persian carpet, spread carelessly under her feet. Each time she twirled, her radiant face and her large black eyes seemed to glow for you alone. In the circle all mouths were agape and all eyes staring. She danced to a Basque tambourine which she tinkled above her head, thus displaying her lovely arms. She wore a golden bodice tightly laced about her delicate body, exposing her beautiful shoulders. Below her wasp waist billowed a multicolored skirt, which, in the whirling dance, gave momentary glimpses of her finely shaped legs. With all this, and her black hair and sparkling eyes, she seemed like something more than human. In truth, thought Gringoire, it is a salamander, a nymph, a goddess, a bacchante of Mount Menelaus. At that moment one of the braids of this salamander's hair loosened, and the thong of yellow leather that had bound it fell to the ground. "Oh no, oh no," said he, "it's a gypsy." All the illusion faded. As she resumed her dance, she picked up from the ground 2 swords, the points of which she balanced on her forehead, making them turn in one direction while she spun in another. Indeed, she was a gypsy. Yet, disenchanted as Gringoire might be, the whole scene was not without its charm and magic. The bonfire threw upon her a weird red light which itself danced over the circle of faces as well as over the brown forehead of the girl, and, at the far end of the square, it cast a pale light that mingled on one side with the shimmering shadows of the old, dark, wrinkled facade of the pillar house, while on the other side it slid over the stone arms of the gibbet. Among the many faces which the glow of the fire dyed a crimson red, there was one which seemed to be more than all the rest absorbed in watching the dancer. It was the face of a man, austere, calm, somber. This man, whose dress was hidden by the crowd, did not appear to be more than 35 years of age, yet he was bald, having at his temples only a few clumps of thin gray hair. His broad, high forehead was beginning to show wrinkles, but in his deep-set eyes there shone an extraordinary gleam, portending a youthful spirit, an ardent vitality, and a depth of passion. He kept them fixed on the gypsy, but as the young girl of 16 continued her frenzied dance to the utter delight of the crowd, his demeanor seemed to grow more and more gloomy. Occasionally a smile and a sigh would meet on his lips, but the smile was the sadder of the two. Finally the girl, out of breath, stopped dancing, and the people applauded enthusiastically. "Jelly!" cried the gypsy. Then Gringoire saw a pretty little white goat appear, a lively, nimble, glossy animal with gilt horns, gilt hoofs, and a gilt collar, which he had not noticed before, and which until then had remained crouching on a corner of the carpet watching her mistress dance. "Jelly," said the dancer, "now it's your turn." Sitting down beside the goat, she gracefully offered the Basque tambourine to her. "Jelly," she continued, "what month of the year is it?" The goat lifted her forefoot and struck one stroke on the tambourine. It was, in fact, the first month. The crowd applauded. "Jelly," resumed the girl, turning her tambourine over, "what day of the month is it?" Jolly lifted her small gilt hoof and struck the tambourine 6 times. "Jolly," continued the Egyptian, again changing the side of the tambourine, "what time is it?" Jolly struck 7 times, and just then the tower clock of the pillar house struck 7. The people were amazed. "There is witchcraft here!" yelled one sinister voice in the crowd. This came from the bald man whose eyes had never left the gypsy. She trembled and turned away, but the applause burst out again, smothering the morose exclamation. Apparently her apprehension was thus dispelled. At any rate, she continued to interrogate the goat. "Jolly, show us how Master Guichard Grand Remy, captain of the town pistoliers, walks in the Candlemas procession." Jolly stood up on her hind legs and began bleating, at the same time walking with such a genteel gravity that the entire crowd burst out laughing at this miming of the pompous captain's manner. "Jali," resumed the girl, emboldened by her increasing success, "show how Master Jacques Charmolue, the king's attorney in the ecclesiastical court, preaches." The goat sat down on her rump and began to bleat, shaking her front feet in such a strange fashion that, except for the bad French and bad Latin, as to gestures, accent, and the very posture, it was Jacques Charmolue in the flesh. The crowd applauded more wildly than before. "Sacrilege! Profanation!" cried the same voice from the bald-headed man. Once more the gypsy turned away. Again she said, "Oh, it's that wicked man!" Then, protruding her lower lip beyond the upper, she made a little pout which seemed to be characteristic of her. She arose and, spinning on her heel, began to pass her tambourine for the people's contributions. Silver and copper coins, large and small, clattered into the receptacle. Presently she paused in front of Gringoire, who absent-mindedly put his hand into his pocket. "The devil!" muttered the poet as he found at the bottom of his pocket only reality, that is to say, nothing. The pretty girl just waited, holding out her tambourine, and stared at him with her huge eyes. Perspiration beaded Gringoire's forehead. If he had had all Peru in his pocket, he would certainly have given it to this dancer, but Gringoire had not Peru in his pocket, and besides, America was not yet discovered. Fortunately, he was saved by an unexpected incident. "Will you be gone, you Egyptian grasshopper?" cried a hoarse voice from the darkest corner of the square. The girl turned away frightened. This wasn't the voice of the bald-headed man. It was a woman's voice, an intense, spiteful voice. Furthermore, this cry, which had frightened the gypsy, delighted a band of children who were running about. "It's the recluse from the Tour Roland!" they shouted with excessive bursts of laughter. "It's the sachette who's scolding her. Hasn't she eaten yet? Let's carry her something from the town buffet." And away they ran to the pillar house. Meanwhile, Gringoire took advantage of the girl's trouble to lose himself in the crowd. The shouting of the children reminded him that he, too, had not supped. He therefore also hurried to the public buffet, but the little brats had better legs than he. When he arrived, they had stripped the table clean. There wasn't even a wretched morsel of bread left. There was nothing now against the wall but the light fleur-de-lis intermingled with rose bushes, painted there in 1434 by Mathieu Biterne, a meagre meal indeed. It is not pleasant to go to bed without supper. It is still less pleasant to go without supper and not know where one is going to bed. Yet this was Gringoire's plight. No bread, no lodging. He saw himself pressed on all sides by harsh necessity. He had long since discovered this truth, that Jupiter had created men in a fit of misanthropy, and that, throughout the life of a philosopher, his destiny holds his philosophy in a state of siege. As for him, he had never seen the blockade so complete. He heard his empty stomach rumbling, and he thought it very ill-ordained that evil destiny should take his philosophy by famine. He was sinking deeper and deeper into melancholy, when a strange singing, but remarkably sweet, suddenly aroused him. It was the young Egyptian. Her voice had the same quality as her beauty and her dance. It was indefinably charming. There was about it something pure, rich, aerial, winged, as it were. It encompassed a succession of variations, of melodies, of unexpected cadences, then simple strains, interspersed with sharp, even whistling notes, running into sounds that would have confused a nightingale, but in which harmony was ever preserved, followed by soft octave undulations which rose and fell even as the bosom of the young singer. Her beautiful face followed with singular expressiveness every capricious variation of the music, from its wildest inspiration to its almost chaste dignity. You would have imagined her at one moment a maniac, at another a queen. The words she sang were of a language unknown to Gringoire. Apparently they were even unknown to her, So little did the expression which she gave in singing correspond with the meaning of the words. Thus, in her voice, these 4 verses were full of sparkling gaiety. Un cofre de gran riqueza hallaron dentro un pilar. Dentro del, nuevas banderas con figuras de espantar. And, again, a moment afterward, she applied the same tone to this stanza. Alarabes de caballo sin poderse menear, con espadas y los cuellos, ballestas de buen echar. Gringoire felt the tears filling his eyes. Yet her song was a breath of joy, and she sang like a bird, from pure serenity and lightness of heart. The gypsy's song had troubled Gringoire's thoughts, but gently, as a swan ripples the water. He listened with a kind of rapture and forgetfulness of everything else. In several hours, this was the first interval during which he did not suffer. The moment was brief. The same female voice which had interrupted the gypsy's dance rang out again to interrupt her song. "Will you be quiet, you cricket from hill?" It sounded from the same dark corner of the square. The poor cricket did stop short, and Gringoire stopped his ears. "Oh," he screamed, "you cursed jagged-toothed saw who come to break the lyre!" The rest of the spectators murmured like him. "The devil take the old hag!" cried some. "The devil take the old hag!" cried some of them, and the old invisible spoil-sport might have had reason to repent her attacks on the gypsy, had the attention of the crowd not been distracted by the procession of the Pope of Fools, which, having paraded through many streets and neighborhoods, was now, with all its torches and clamor, pouring into the Place de Grève. This procession, which our readers saw leaving the palace, had organized itself en route. It had recruited all the ruffians, all the idle thieves, all the unoccupied vagabonds of Paris, so that when it reached the Grève it presented a most disreputable aspect. First came the Egyptians, led by the Duke of Egypt, followed by his counts on foot, holding his bridle and stirrup. Behind them, pell-mell, came Egyptian men and women, with screaming little children on their backs, all of them, duke, counts, and people, in rags and tinsel. Then came the kingdom of Argot, that is, all the thieves of France, arranged in groups according to their dignity, the lowest coming first. Thus they paraded 4 by 4, with the different insignia proclaiming their degrees in this strange faculty. Most of them were crippled in one way or another. Some limped, others lacked an arm. Their ranks included shoplifters, pilgrims, housebreakers, sham epileptics, gold brickers, drunks, sham cripples, card sharks, arsonists, hawkers, pickpockets, arch-thieves, master-thieves, dotards, and infirm derelicts. A list long enough to weary Homer himself. In the center of the conclave, surrounded by the arch-thieves and the master-thieves, you could barely make out the King of Argot, the Grand Coeur, squatting in a little wagon, pulled by 2 massive dogs. After the kingdom of Argot came the Empire of Galilee. Guillaume Rousseau, emperor of the Galilean Empire, marched majestically in his robe of purple stained with wine, preceded by mummers sham-fighting and dancing war dances. Surrounding this emperor were his mace-bearers, his satellites, and his clerks of finance. Lastly came the Besos in black robes, with its maypoles, its music worthy of the Sabbath, and its large yellow wax candles. In the center of this mixed parade, the high officers of the Brotherhood of Fools bore upon their shoulders a litter laden with more candles than the shrine of Saint Genevieve at the time of the pestilence. High upon this litter, mitred, coped, resplendent, and carrying a crosier, rode the new Pope of Fools, the bell-ringer of Notre-Dame, Quasimodo the Hunchback. Each section of this grotesque procession played its special music. The Egyptians, their balafos, and their African tambourines. The Argotiers, a most unmusical race, had only a viol, a bugle, and a Gothic rebec of the 12th century. The Empire of Galilee, only a little more advanced than the Argotiers, barely could be heard playing Re, La, Mi on a rebec. But around the Pope of Fools was executed, in magnificent cacophony, all the musical richness of the age, treble rebecs, tenor rebecs, not to mention flutes and brass instruments. Alas, our readers will recollect that this was Gringoire's orchestra. It is difficult to give an idea of how much pride and beatific satisfaction was registered on the usually sad and always hideous visage of Quasimodo as he rode in state from the palace to the Place de Grève. It was the first moment of self-love he had ever enjoyed, indeed, that he had ever experienced. Until now he had known only humiliation, disdain for his condition, and disgust for his person. So, deaf as he was, he savored, like a true pope, the acclamation of those people whom he hated because he felt himself hated by them. What did it matter if his subjects were a mob of fools, cripples, thieves, beggars? Still they were people, and he was their king. He took seriously all the ironical applause, all the mock respect, to which, we hasten to add, there was mixed in the crowd a certain amount of very real fear. Though a hunchback, he was strong, even strong. Though bow-legged, he was quick. Though deaf, he was evil, 3 attributes that temper ridicule. Furthermore, it is highly improbable that the new Pope of Fools himself was fully conscious of the emotions he experienced or of those he inspired. The mind that dwelt in that defective body was necessarily somewhat incomplete and deaf. Also, when he felt at that moment was to him absolutely vague. What he felt at that moment was to him absolutely vague, indistinct, and confused. Only joy filled his heart. Pride showed even in his poor bearing. Around that gloomy, unhappy countenance there was a halo of delight. Therefore, it was not without surprise and dread that, all at once, at the moment when Quasimodo, in this state of half-intoxication, was being borne triumphantly past the pillar-house, a man was seen to dart from the crowd and, with an angry gesture, snatch from the hunchback's hands the crozier of gilt wood, the ensign of his pretended papacy. This fellow, this rash person, was the same man with the bald head who, a moment ago, half hidden by the crowd, had frightened the poor gypsy with his threatening words, so full of hatred. Now one could see that he wore a priest's robe. The moment he stepped from the crowd, Gringoire, who had taken no note of him till then, recognized him. "Well," he cried, with amazement, "it's my master in Hermes, Dom Claude Frollo, the Archdeacon. What the devil does he want with that one-eyed monster? He'll get himself eaten." Indeed, a cry of terror arose from the mob. The formidable Quasimodo had leaped from the litter. Women turned away their eyes so as not to see him tear the Archdeacon to shreds. He made one bound to the priest, squinted at him, and fell to his knees. The priest snatched the tiara from Quasimodo's head, broke the fake crozier, and ripped the tinsel cope. Quasimodo remained on his knees, with bowed head and joined hands. Next, these two began a strange dialogue of signs and gestures, for neither of them spoke a word. The priest, standing there, angry, threatening, imperious. Quasimodo, prostrated, humble, suppliant. Yet it is certain that Quasimodo could have crushed the priest with his thumb. Directly, the Archdeacon, roughly shaking Quasimodo's powerful shoulders, made a sign for him to get up and follow him. Quasimodo rose. Then the Brotherhood of Fools, their first stupor being over, wanted to defend their pope, so rudely dethroned. The Egyptians, the Argotiers, and all the Besos came yelping around the priest. Quasimodo stood between the crowd and the priest, clenching his huge fists. He looked at the assailants, gnashing his teeth like an angry tiger. The priest resumed his somber gravity, made a sign to Quasimodo, and they walked away in silence. Quasimodo preceded him, scattering the crowd as they passed along. When they had made their way through the multitude and had crossed the square, the mob of curious idlers wanted to follow them. Quasimodo then took up a position behind the Archdeacon, but followed him backward, looking as though ready to attack. His monstrous, shaggy body on his awkward bow legs, his tongue licking his ugly tusks, his growling like a wild beast impressed the crowd. His slightest gesture now caused a tremor of fear to ripple through the mob. So he and the Archdeacon passed into a dark and narrow street, where no one dared to follow, so effectually was its entrance barred by the mere image of Quasimodo, now seeming more beast than man. "All this is marvellous," said Gringoire, "but where the devil am I to find supper?"